Hi, good afternoon. So I'm Ixchel Faniel. I'm going to be talking a little bit about research data management today, specifically what makes for successful data reuse. So I'm assuming all are familiar with research data management, but if not, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what I meant by that. It includes a lot of activities, typically things that occur throughout the data lifecycle, so we can see the design and creation of research data, storage, security, preservation, retrieval, sharing, and reuse. So I thought in talking about reuse, I'd start with a couple of examples. And there's another chair over here if someone would like to sit down. I see people kind of gathering at the edges. So the first example of data reuse is actually an example of data reuse for research. So here we have an example of marine biologists who reuse data from the New York Public Library, 45,000 restaurant menus, along with other sources. And they wanted to test whether a particular species of fish were being over-harvested in the 1920s off the coast of California. In another example of data reuse, I thought I'd throw in a teaching and learning example. This is actually a tweet that went out at the beginning of the year, I believe, where someone is thanking Mark for publishing his archaeological data from his excavations in Egypt and at open context, because it allowed the students to have a hands-on learning experience with data, excavation data. So given those examples, let's talk a little bit about what makes for successful reuse. If people are familiar with research data management, they know the FAIR data principles, data that's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable is important. There's been a lot of work being done in these areas. I'm specifically going to talk about reuse today and reusable data, specifically from a researcher's perspective. And so what makes for successful data reuse? We've been studying data practices in the social science, zoology, and archaeology communities. And what we found in terms of successful data reuse, it requires researchers having information about the data, typically from scholarly records, such that they can evaluate data's quality. And so today I'm going to talk about those three elements. So information about the data, where they're typically getting that information, and the kinds of data quality attributes they're taking into consideration in their decisions. So this is based on interviews with 105 researchers in those three areas, interviews and observations. So I thought I'd start first by talking about the information data reusers need. We call it context information, and I started studying data reuse probably in 2010. I was particularly interested and found the importance of the context of data's production was important, and kind of walked away with that understanding. And by data production, you can see in this square here, we're talking about information about data collection. In the case of zoologists and archaeologists, we're talking about specimen and artifact information. Information about the data producer is important, data analysis information, missing data, and research objectives. But what we found with this study that we've done over probably since, again, 2010, we found different types of categories of information were also important. Repository information in terms of provenance and reputation and history of the repository. Curation and digitization information, as well as information about data reuse. Whoops, they told me that would happen. So what do I mean about this? Prior reuse, terms of use, and advice on reuse. So these are 12 different types of context information that we found that researchers mentioned in terms of when they were making decisions about data reuse. These 12 types of context information are here on this screen as well. They're just arranged a little bit differently. So here we're talking, and they're arranged by the frequency with which the researchers mention these different types of context during their interviews. So it's probably not a surprise here that data collection information is at the top. 3/4 of researchers across these three disciplines mentioned data collection information. We had, for instance, social scientists that we interviewed. They reused quantitative data from surveys and questionnaires. They mentioned data collection information the most, followed by information about the data producer, data analysis information, and prior reuse information was also important for this group. For zoologists who reuse specimen data, so we can think about data about birds, about insects, about mollusks, They mention specimen information the most, followed by data collection information, provenance, and data producer information. And then lastly, we have the archaeologists, who reuse artifacts collected from excavation. So we can think about animal bones, coins, pieces of pottery. So they look similar to the zoologists in terms of what they were mentioning, but data collection information was mentioned the most, followed by artifact information and provenance information. Those were mentioned about to the same frequency. And then data producer information was mentioned a little less frequently in this case. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the different kinds of information, just to kind of give you a sense of when they're talking about this information, what they're really saying. So here, researchers interested in data collection information also often wanted information about the study procedures. So here we have an archaeologist explaining differences in how archaeologists walk an excavation site and how that results in different kinds of data being collected, whether they're running into or getting big finds from an excavation site or small finds from an excavation site. And the need to know these kinds of procedures helps archaeologists assess fitness for their reuse, whether or not they can actually reuse the data given their research questions. Here's an example of provenance information that a zoologist talked about. So by provenance information, I'm talking about this idea of being able to trace that data back to its origin, being important. So here, this zoologist is tracing back genetic data that he found in GenBank that someone else created. And he wants to be able to trace it back to the physical specimen where that data came from as a way to build trust in that data. As he says at the very end, he wanted to be able to assess or assure that that species that they've identified in GenBank is actually saying what they're saying it is, right? And then lastly, we have an example of prior reuse. So data that appears in publications in the social science community typically indicates a level of peer review or acceptance within that disciplinary community. So here we have a social scientist discussing the role of prior reuse in her community when formulating her opinion about the data. She says she's never actually had to make an independent judgment about the data because it's federally funded, nationally representative, and very widely used within the community. So that's her way of building trust in that data, knowing that it's been reused widely within the community. So given the different types of context information, I thought I'd talk a little bit about where do researchers find this information? And as I said, they typically find it in scholarly records. And these scholarly records, as you see, vary by discipline. But we found 7 key record types. So for archaeologists, we have data producer records. Those were mentioned the most frequently. And these are typically records that are generated in the field at an excavation site. So we can think about photos and hand-drawn maps and diagrams and data entry forms that they're filling out as they're excavating pieces of pottery from a trench, right? It could also be written narratives, right, in their field notebooks. If by comparison, if we look at some of the zoologists, they relied heavily on the physical specimens themselves, along with museum records and repository records. Peer-reviewed publications were also important, as well as the data producers' records. And we can see social scientists here mentioning a little bit of everything in terms of the sources, right? They talk about all of them to some degree, but they specifically talk about code books and documentation the most. And the interesting thing to me here, I talk about scholarly records, but we've also found that people are also important. So whether they're social scientists who have been reusing data for decades or archaeologists who are new to data reuse, people are still an important factor in terms of getting different kinds of context information that they need to be able to make decisions about the data. So regardless of whether or not we're talking about online repositories or digital data, humans are really kind of still an important piece in this puzzle here. So again, next I'll just give you some quick examples just to give you a flavor of kind of what they're talking about when they talk about these different sources. So I'll talk about 3 of the top. And code books, these are typically things that are created by repository staff in the social science community. They're usually based on information captured in data producer records, whether it's Word documents or some kind of SPSS file or Excel file where the data resides. These codebooks typically hold information about data collection methods and other data production processes, survey questions, sampling methodologies, different kinds of analyses that have been performed. Now, repository staff may add additional information here, such as descriptive statistics, missing data reports, or data producer publications. People. So in archaeology, people were mostly used to discover and access the data or context information about that data. So archaeologist 9 here is talking about not only needing more data, but actually being able to talk to the original excavator because to clarify some things that had happened in that excavation, given photos he had seen, maps that he had seen, and other kinds of descriptions that he's been reading about the excavation site. He needed more information. And then lastly, we have peer-reviewed publications. So I talked about peer-reviewed publications in the social science community and their desire to want publications that people who had reused the data wanted, to be able to say, okay, lots of folks are using this data, lots of folks trust this data, lots of folks have published reusing this data, it's probably okay data. Here, zoologists are actually using peer-reviewed publications that the data producer wrote because they're looking to discover and access the data. So here, this one zoologist is actually talking about accessing a data from a journal that's been, as this person calls, locked away in PDF format. So given that we have this idea of the different types of context information that researchers talk about, as well as kind of how that data was reused being important, and where that data was stored in terms of the different sources, they're needing all of these things to evaluate the quality of the data. And by quality of the data, we can think about that. It's multifaceted, as you can see here. So it's about being able to make decisions about the data in terms of its relevance, its ease of operation, its accessibility, its credibility, its interoperability, whether or not it's complete data, right? The data producer's reputation is also something that kind of takes on this idea of data quality. Now, all of these different attributes are being used, as I said, to make decisions about the data. In subsequent research, we've actually done quantitative study with social scientists and actually measured these different quality attributes and found that the presence of some of these qualities were actually positively related to the social scientists' satisfaction with data reuse. So it's not just about making decisions about whether or not the data is reusable, it's about whether or not they're satisfied with their experience at the end. And we're finding that a lot of these factors come into play when they're deciding whether or not they're satisfied. And that's after they've published in the journal. And we've controlled for that, and some of these are still significant in that way. So given all of this, I thought I'd talk a little bit about implications and kind of also, if you have questions, I'll take some of those in the end as well. But I think this first idea, and again, it's given my initial study that I did in this area. Reuse requires more than data production information. Information about the repository is important. Information about reuse is important when the reusers are making decisions about whether or not they want to reuse data. And some of these types of information are readily capturable. Some are not, right? So when we think about repository reputation and history, a lot of the times researchers were spreading that word of mouth among themselves. So given that, one thing to think about is kind of how, as folks that may be repository staff or in charge of repositories or work with repositories, how can you kind of shape that narrative such that you're helping the reusers formulate their perceptions around your repository, right? Thinking about ways to do that. The second is this idea of whether data reuse needs can be met is really a question. It's a direct result of the data deposit requirements, right? So what are you asking your data producers to provide or to share? And how would you, a question for you is, how would you fare in an evaluation of data deposit requirements against the reuser needs that I just talked about today? Like, how well matched are those things, right? And are you asking them for the right things? And if you're actually receiving the right types of context, are you getting that information in enough detail, right? In terms of the different the different examples that I talked about today. And then lastly, as I said, I kind of have focused on data reuse needs for the past, I don't know, I can almost say decade now, which is kind of like, oh my gosh, I've studied this for a decade, right? But I've focused only on that in part because a lot of people weren't studying it. But those aren't the only needs that are kind of in this experience of research data management. We have data reusers needs, we have data producers needs, we have data manager and data curators needs, right? We have all these needs, and for successful RDM, if you want that data to flow through the life cycle from creation to reuse more smoothly, if I just think about those three groups, right? Those three groups, all of their needs have to be taken into consideration. And those needs may not necessarily be well matched point to point, right? So as an intermediary, when I think about libraries and libraries' role, they're kind of well positioned between the folks that are depositing the data and the folks that are reusing the data. So how can you and your different roles, is another question, kind of serve as a catalyst in working to align those different needs, right? So with that, I'm looking for my laptop to advance the slides. I forget I can do it this way. I just want to thank a lot of the DIPPER project members. As I said, this has kind of been over almost 10 years now. And this is I can't say enough about the people who have been behind this and helping us kind of generate all this work and all these studies and presentations. So I want to make sure that I thank them and acknowledge them, as well as IMLS, who has supported this work. And references that you all can kind of take a look at that are also in the slides, and also on the DIPPER website, which I neglected to put on the slides. So you can Google that if you'd like, an OCLC. But also, again, just thank you for your time today. I know there's lots of stuff going on because I can hear it as I'm presenting. So I appreciate your time and attention as well. Thanks.